excited to be here today to present this topic called digital disruption. My name is Tony Vecchiato. I'm the Vice President of Digital Strategy at Team Detroit. And for those of you who don't know who Team Detroit is actually the agency of record for Ford Motor Company. So we do all of the advertising globally for Ford, from the traditional print, television, all the way through digital. So marketing in terms of social, mobile, and even in-car marketing. So we're the entire agency. So what I want to do is get right to it. I'm going to introduce, or have our panelists introduce themselves, starting with Kurt. Kurt,
Sure.
can you introduce?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name's Kurt Uncle. I'm the Chief Digital Officer at Team Detroit. Tony stole my thunder on what Team Detroit is. So, but yeah, we're focused on Ford and some other clients as well, and really excited about being here and having so many of you guys turn out for this. So hopefully we'll do you proud and make it interesting.
Good afternoon. My name is Don Abraham. I'm an Executive Vice President at the Futures Company. We've done some work with Team Detroit and also lots of other organizations, helping them think about the future. And that's really what I do in my business, is I help organizations understand the change that's taking place around them and understand what it means for them in terms of threats and opportunities. So thank you for the opportunity.
Hi, I'm Eric Pfeiffer. I'm the Director of Mobility at VML. VML headquartered out of Kansas City, 26 locations across the globe. Digital agency of record for a lot of great brands, including the likes of Gatorade, Kimberly-Clark, Kellogg's, and more. Everything that is mobile application development, mobile strategy comes out of my group at VML. I'm very excited to be a part of the conversation with you today.
Hey, I'm Nikhil Sethi, co-founder and CEO of a company called Adaptly. We're a media buying technology for social and increasingly mobile messaging applications. Again, work closely with a bunch of folks in the room, and excited to be here and talk about disruption.
All right, thanks guys. So last year we came here and we wanted to do something different for the panel. We wanted to be a little bit more interactive, and it actually worked pretty well. So we're trying that same format again this year. So we really want to take a look and get the audience participation. So if you have any questions or you have feedback, just like Waze is a good crowdsourcing app for information on traffic, we want your ideas. We want your feedback on, what have you done with your experiences in your companies. So we have a couple mic runners. We have Christian up here, and we have another one over here. So you just raise your hand so we can get, there's a big crowd, so make sure we can get a mic to you for your feedback. And we also have Content Studio here with us today. So back in the right-hand corner, we have our Content Studio. So we have a group of very talented people that comb the social sphere, and they interact with Ford's marketing audiences. So we have a kind of a mini team here today, and they're going to be actually taking tweets too. So if you have any questions, I'm going to try to take a few tweets today. So just tweet team at Team Detroit, and we'll take your questions too. So with that, I'd like to get into the topic of digital disruption. And when we talk about digital disruption, we really start talking about innovation. But innovation and digital disruption are two different things. So what we wanted to do as part of the panel is when we sat down as panelists, we're like, well, we really need to kind of define what we're talking about here. So the first thing is we're gonna talk about just what is innovation. And I'm gonna turn it over to Don here, because Don kind of brought a topic or a definition of what innovation is. So we'll start there, and then we'll add to that.
So innovation, as we've thought about it, and as I've thought about it for a long time, is a tricky question. We use the word a lot, we use the phrase a lot, and rarely is there actually a definition you can use to structure what is innovation from what isn't innovation. And the definition that we often use to talk about innovation is, it's the realization of value from a new solution to a problem. Now the reason for that language is actually very intentional. We talk about the realization of value, and that helps to distinguish creative ideas from innovative ideas. That is, you can have a great idea that you can't monetize or turn into something that is of value. Well, that's not innovation. Innovation actually has to have that value exchange. And then the new solution to a problem, again, tries to focus in on solving problems as opposed to just more. Right? So innovation being the realization of value from a new solution to a problem, oftentimes changing the game. And changing the game is the last aspect that's important, because you're really trying to move the needle here. Whether you're trying to make the world a better place, you're trying to solve for a new problem, you're trying to solve for some issue you're struggling with, and we're going to talk about how digital disruption ties into that. That's kind of how we think about these things. So I think the definition should be coming along shortly. There it is.
All right. Does anyone else have a different innovation definition that they want to share? I'll pick on people. I will. I did last year. What do you think innovation is? I told you I'd pick on.
Yeah, okay. Well, I hope basically it's to have a new idea which changes the way of doing business.
A new way of doing business. So when we think about digital disruption now, we kind of define digital disruption in terms of innovation. We look at it as, and I have a definition here. So digital disruption is an innovation that displaces an existing market. And that word displaces, I think, is important when we talk about this definition. It displaces an existing market, industry, or technology and produces something new and more efficient and worthwhile. So when we talk about digital disruption, and here's the audience participation, so we tend to put things into two different groups. You look scared, like I'm going to call on you. Oh, okay. We tend to classify things in terms of two different things: the person or the company that's doing the disrupting, and then the company that's getting disruptive. So when we look at the companies in the industry that have been disruptive or being disrupted, who do you think about? What are some names of some companies that you think about? You can just Kodak, Blockbuster. What? Yeah. All right.
Very specific.
Right, and that's what, like, when we're thinking about those different companies, things like Blockbusters, things like Borders came to mind. So as Netflix came on board and Amazon and the Kindle came on board, they really disrupted the industry, right? They put those companies actually out of business. So I think we need to take a look at that. So what are some companies? Let's turn it around. What are some companies in terms of that are actually doing the disrupting? Uber? Did I hear Uber? All right. Airbnb? Yeah. What else? How about up there?
U-ship.
U-ship. What's U-ship?
Disrupting shipping.
Okay. So is that an on-demand type of service, or?
Aggregated shipping, similar to Uber, as I understand.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So one of the things that we want to talk about, actually, and we looked at Uber as kind of our case study for today. So we want to talk about that, and I want to ask Kurt a question here about Uber. So how is Uber disrupting the industry? You know, are they disrupting the industry? What are the industries that they're disrupting?
Sure.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
I think Uber is really interesting in the sense that we all perceive it's being disruptive. I would put forth that what it's disrupted so far is just frustration. You know, it's always been frustrating to actually get a cab or find transportation, and so the near-term thing that Uber is doing that's so compelling and interesting is actually solving that. It's bringing supply and demand together in a very simplified way that's adding a lot of convenience to our life, and that's really addictive, and it's really interesting as to what it's possible. And so I think that's a big part of what Uber's doing today. But where Uber's headed, or the potential is this idea of the autonomous car and this ability to actually really eliminate some of these needs we have on say, a taxi system or any of these other type of transportations that today it's just facilitating an easier connection with. And I think the implications for that long term as we think about the ability to just get a car on demand. I now have a whole different ballgame around insurance. I have a whole different ballgame around finance and what it means to own a car. And so it's that fascination of what's possible, I think, as it relates to the experience that Uber can lead us to, that is really what's most disruptive and interesting today.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think you think of Uber as it stands today, but the other verticals that it can get into, food delivery, shipping in general. How do we connect those types of ecosystems and those other needs into the Uber ecosystem, if you will? And that's where I start getting really excited about where this can go.
I think a great framework too. I don't know if any of you guys have read this book by Peter Thiel's 0 to 1. It's a really kind of interesting concept too, to kind of put a sort of structure around disruption. Is something sort of, just incrementally increasing the value of something, sort of this 1 to n idea, or is it actually a 0 to 1 concept? I think kind of Kurt's point there is really interesting too, is sort of the first sort of steps that Uber has taken, and many of these sort of on-demand services are in some ways kind of a 1 to n solution, right? I mean, they're sort of incrementally better at solving frustration and sort of decentralizing the problem. But I think the forward-looking thesis thesis there is really compelling. Kind of what is the 0 to 1 transformation that's coming? And you think about autonomous vehicles and things like that. That's kind of really pushing the framework forward. But I think kind of thinking about things that, what's the difference between incremental innovation and incremental disruption versus sort of transformational, the sort of 0 to 1 kind of idea is really, really interesting.
There's one other angle to it that I think is interesting, and you referenced this earlier, which is matching up supply with demand. And one of the things here that's kind of unique is when you think about digital disruption, it feels like a new world that we're entering, and new transformative powers have been unleashed. But at the end of the day, it really is about matching up supply and demand in ways that, whether it's with Uber, where the regulatory environment precluded that from taking place, or other kind of structures were in place that limited what could be done. Really, the question that they asked was, why can't that be done? Why can't we match supply with demand in a profound way? And digital disruption is really the vehicle they use to get to that endpoint. But I'm kind of intrigued by the classic nature of what's taking place here.
When it's really about convenience, right? I mean, I think at the core, it's convenience is sort of the new black, or sort of the convenience is the mother of all invention, in the sense that we're all seeking in this very complicated world easier things to do, right? And the real attraction, I mean, the first time I remember even using Uber years ago was, holy shit, I can actually get this car with no effort. I don't even have to hail a cab. So if you're an introvert, you're like, this is awesome, and really kind of attracted to that. So I think that's like a really compelling thing that's going on in the space right now, is looking at these points of convenience that we can create and add, and a lot of energy is going against that. And that's a fascinating trajectory we're on.
And so you get even better. I'm sure you saw the Apple Watch demo for Uber, which is like literally one button, and the car comes.
It's easier and easier.
Yeah, and Kurt talks about Uber and convenience. So last night we went out to our team dinner, and we walked out. We literally had 3 blocks to walk, and I'm walking. It's nice weather, and what does he do? He pulls out this phone and is like looking for an Uber. I'm like,
I was going further.
What's that?
I was going further.
Oh, okay. So do you guys think Uber is going to be around forever, or do you think? What do you think?
Yes.
You think so? Why do you think they're going to be around?
Yes.
Exactly for the reason you've said, because they're meeting a huge demand, and it's extended into the community.
Okay, thank you.
I think enough demand that VCs are obviously getting involved. It was just announced, I think, earlier today or yesterday at Lyft, and there's been a lot of controversy around Uber blocking funding of Lyft, but Lyft yesterday confirmed $500 million in funding to again proliferate and accelerate this work even more. So.
And I think Uber is really leading to this trend that they're talking about, and this on-demand trend. And if we can look on the screens here, I literally did a quick search when I was putting together this panel, and we have hotels tonight. So I used hotels tonight a month ago. I went to Chicago and I needed a hotel very quickly. I got online, so it connects the surplus rooms at a very discounted rate to their customers on demand. TaskRabbit is another example of what we're looking at here in terms of disrupting the industry in terms of on-demand services. So TaskRabbit, if you have errands to do around your house or tasks to do, it connects you with your neighbors and your neighborhood and geography, and they can do your tasks for you. Vet Pronto, just like it sounds, instead of you taking your pet to the vet, the veterinarian comes to your house. And it was funny because I was even online and on Facebook, and the last one that's up there is around therapy. And I'm like, no, it can't be. And I clicked on the ad, and it was actually a downloaded app. Yeah, it was therapy on demand, that you could actually download an app and chat with a therapist. But that's really taking kind of on demand to the next level. So when we talk about Uber, the Uberization of everything, can you kind of add to that and how that's becoming a trend in the industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually I like the definition Don used here, right? So this is matching supply and demand. What is this at its root, right? You're basically just using now this network that we have, this beautiful thing called the internet, and just bringing things that took too many steps in the past and kind of reducing the friction there, right? And so that has an impact on every service and every kind of utility that we may use. And if anything, it's only going to continue to proliferate. I think the question that I would have and ask back is kind of what comes after that, right? What level of disruption, what level of sort of digital use cases exist beyond just matching supply and demand, and how does that continue to kind of impact our lives?
There's this obviously larger empowerment of the masses to provide services for each other. Yeah. I'm going to fail on this very bad, but Top Gear is one of my favorite shows, the British version. And in a recent episode, I don't know if you've watched, they were trying to build a faster ambulance, and they failed. But in that example they gave of a company in New York that has now empowered people to actually respond to emergencies within close to 4 minutes of the emergency happening. So they've empowered us to help others rather than having to wait for an ambulance to get there. I forget the name, but it's just this larger empowerment of service and matching again up the supply and demand.
There's another great example, actually. I think this is the name of the company called FireChat. I don't know if you've heard about this, but basically, they've come up with a system for messaging that doesn't use the telco provider at all. And so in the Hong Kong protests this last couple of months, basically people, who couldn't chat to their friends or organize, groups of people or whatever, just basically use localized Bluetooth to have chats with each other. So there's all kinds of really interesting use cases of technology, not just for bringing you goods and services, but also now disrupting sort of, hey, maybe we don't need these massive sort of network infrastructures to have basic communication with people in a room. That stuff's really, really exciting and actually has a giant ripple effect across major industries.
As you think of the extension of AirDrop and being able to have our own personal networks and communicating across that.
Absolutely.
Exactly. I think what would also be interesting in these trends is the role of like identity online, right? So the internet started and it's an anonymous media, that's really attractive about it. But as all these services kind of come online, this sort of barrier to entry for anybody to provide anything really begs the question, like, who am I dealing with on the other side? And so the shift from being an anonymous medium into sort of one where identity matters, and also my value as someone being known and an ability to say, yes, I validate that or support that, and is really essential to these services. I mean, you think about Talkspace therapy in particular. I don't want to talk to any Wahoo, but the idea that people with an identity have validated and I trust those people is a really interesting thing that's going to, I think, really be an underpinning for another round of shakeup in the internet.
And I think actually that's going to be the topic for after everything we're talking about in terms of Uberization, right? I think the next topic really is, and I really think we still are confused about identity, right? I mean, there's a ton of new companies that are popping up that are sort of selling the proposition of, hey, you can be anonymous and you can still get these services. I think we'll talk about that next as well within the context of messaging. But I think that's going to be the next sort of 10, 20 years of conversation, right? Do we believe in sort of real identity versus anonymity, being anonymous basically within this?
But there's one more piece I want to go back to, which is the question of will Uber be around forever, right? And that's a really interesting question that the answer is no. And I'll tell you why, right? So first of all, if you go back even 5 years, 10 years, MySpace and other kinds of disruptors at that time were running rampant. And they set the seeds for what we see today. You can argue that Uber is right now working to set the seeds for what will come next. But what's going to also come next is regulatory, right? So there's a whole new wave of laws and regulations that will eventually catch up to whether it's protect riders or help identify who the driver is or who the therapist is you're talking to. There's got to be some sort of a mechanism that ensures safety, that ensures what task you're actually outsourcing gets done by the right person as opposed to anybody. No offense, but I don't want you saving my life if something happens in the next 4 minutes. So there's a whole question there of what happens next and how does the regulatory environment and the safety mechanism that originally gave birth to the taxi system. I mean, taxis, the reason you had that taxi license was you had to know what you were doing. You had to demonstrate that you were able to not only pay for and supply the vehicle, but also you knew where you were going. And there's an interesting gap that we've got right now, and that's where disruption is born. The gap between the regulatory environment that you live within and the supply and demand that you're trying to satisfy against. And that's where disruption takes place, but doesn't always last for a long period of time because eventually they do even out again. I think if the marketplace is compelling enough, like what they've built, and it's simple. We use the word Uber like we use the word Google. I mean, it's a large enough marketplace. It's actually simplified my life. I just want to go to one and find those things that I need. And so it'll be interesting to see, can Uber actually maintain that and be that marketplace to be the Kleenex, of the next realm, right? Because you don't need that many marketplaces. But at the same time, if it is layered in with lots of complexity because the market that they're trying to run and take too big of a cut is going to implode. So greed could actually destroy it if they don't be smart. Good.
I mean, by its very nature, the word disruption is cyclical, right? And it's a very sort of never-ending thing. So from that perspective, yeah, I mean, the companies we talked about as disruptive 50 years ago, right, are no longer around, and the companies we talk about now are no longer going to be around in 50 years too.
So what I want to do is turn a little bit to the kind of the WeChats and Snapchats and WhatsApps of the world. And I'd like to ask the panelists, and maybe Nick, because you're from Adaptly and you deal a lot with this, you can kind of kick off the discussion. But how has Snapchat, how has WeChat changed in terms of digital disruption, the industries, and what industries have they affected?
Yeah, I think there's two important aspects here, right? One is sort of from the consumer standpoint.
Right.
I don't know how many of you guys have touched or used WeChat before. It's more common in the Asian markets, but sort of this basic idea that the way that we interact with applications, with services, through sort of a browser, right, and through sort of a URL bar where you type in where you want to go, is a really flawed way. And actually messaging and chat mechanisms, or IM, if you will, is a better way to interact with services. So for example, in WeChat, you can order a car through sending a message to that sort of a handle, if you will, and say, hey, I need a car right now. And it looks like a chat message that you're communicating to this application, this service to get something. You can get your groceries delivered. Instead of going to an application like we would maybe Postmates here, you can do that all through sort of this chat mechanism. And that's a really interesting idea to say that, hey, is the interface to engage with services and applications changing to be sort of the static notion between URLs and sort of this chat-based mechanism where it feels a lot more human, right? I think from a brand and marketing standpoint, what's really interesting and disruptive here as well is all of these platforms are becoming very, very autonomous, right? They're all saying essentially, we don't need to conform and join all the big ad networks and exchanges to sell our media and to make our inventory available. We can do that in a very decentralized way, just like Uber is decentralizing, rides. And so that notion creates a whole new stress and a whole new pressure on the ecosystem to say that, hey, as these new platforms emerge and become bigger and bigger, and they all become more and more autonomous, they all become more self-directed, how do we deal with a world of 100 of these kind of environments?
I actually have we got a tweet coming in. We have a question for the panelists here. So it says, says Team Detroit, how are you able to quantify that digital disruption is able to build your business? And the second part is, how does this equate to selling more cars? So let's take the first one. How can we quantify that digital disruption is able to build your business? I think that's a really good question.
Yeah.
Well, it depends on what kind of business you're in, right? So as an entrepreneur, $1 is growth. And that's really interesting to think about because a lot of disruption that happens in the digital domain does come from new entrants. And rarely do you see, I would argue, and I'm happy to be corrected by the audience, but I would argue that much of the digital disruption that we've seen comes from completely new entrants, and rarely does it come from incumbents. And as a result of that, the idea of monetizing or quantifying it is an afterthought. Because the fact is, they've spotted something in the business model, they've spotted where the fat is, and they can hit that pain point perfectly and monetize $1, which is a win. I guess the incumbent question is a more challenging one that I'm going to quickly back away from. I don't want to talk about that.
Well, I think what's interesting, in the automotive realm, it's, you just look at like what Tesla's doing. Tesla's come out of nowhere and really kind of gone after a real need in the marketplace or opportunity in the marketplace. And so to quantify the impact of that is, let's just look at what their last numbers were. But I think the other thing to look at is, what's the price of not doing something, right? So we kind of look at where was Blockbuster and they missed it, or where was Kodak when they missed it, and
the cost of inaction.
And basically, that's a serious story or context to put a lot of what the value of actually becoming a shakeup can be.
That's interesting.
Another interesting question asked there too is, can disruption be deliberate? Meaning, so, the management team sitting at Blockbuster, the management team sitting at Kodak, how much of this is serendipitous? How much of this is a bunch of people in a garage somewhere sort of saying, hey, I came up with this new thing, and I don't know if it's disruptive or not. I don't know what the economics are. I don't know what the metrics are around it. I just made it up because it solves my problem better, right? How do I sort of, inject that kind of DNA into an organization without it necessarily being deliberate, right? Sitting down and say, hey, I'm going to disrupt today.
Right, and the Kodak question is always one, and I feel bad for Kodak in some ways because I did work with them a long time ago. They were keenly aware of the disruption that was headed their way. They were very, very aware of every aspect of it. They knew what was coming. They had some technologies around digital. The problem was they couldn't make the math work. They could never find a way to take their business model, which depended on film, which was ridiculously cheap to produce and process, and people had it everywhere, and have that same dollar figure show up when you move into the digital realm. They could not make the math work. And ultimately, it's easy now to look back and like, oh my God, how did Kodak not make the transition? The fact is, they fundamentally couldn't. And I'm curious to know from the audience or others, are there others that have a perspective on that? Because I feel like we make fun of Kodak a lot, but there's more to the story there that's really interesting.
Does anyone have some comments or feedback?
Some comments over here? Yeah, there's a comment in the back.
We'll get you a mic in a second.
That took a while, but regarding that, since there is no economic for the incumbent to disrupt, when an incumbent that has a market position like Kodak had, should they make a spin-off, a start-off, and say that, okay, as an incumbent, we're just going to go for film forever, or for as long as that goes, and harvest that money, and then invest in a new company and say that, okay, when that technology takes off, we'll be there, but as Kodak, we will be gone, and we accept that situation. Would that be the best economic way to do it?
Right. That's a really interesting question, and that was the center point of a book that was written, 15 years ago by Gary Hamel called Leading the Revolution. And it's a really fascinating book for two reasons. One of which is it addresses exactly the point that you make, which is in order to disrupt yourself, you do need to extract some intellectual group and try and put them off on the side and create their own venture. And if it takes flight, you then bring it back into the business. But you start out with that isolated version. And he goes into much more depth because Gary Hamel, obviously being a genius at these kinds of things. That's the first thing that's interesting about that book. The other thing that's interesting about that book is he profiles 3 companies that are doing that. He profiles Shell, the oil company. He profiles Enron, because at the time Enron was doing great stuff. And because the second one was Enron, nobody remembers what the third company was. So the whole thing that's described there around building out that incubator of sorts and having a business off on the side is absolutely one way of going at this that makes a great deal of sense.
I think that's interesting too, and a great model, because I think a lot of times people confuse disruption with only sort of being associated with technology, right? When in fact it actually, impacts business model, impacts the financial aspect of everything that we're doing. It impacts the procurement process. Every sort of individual component of the business should be considered as something that can be disrupted, not just innovation of a new app or a new piece of software, right?
Yeah, and I think we obviously, Team Detroit, we work closely with Ford, and Ford's just made some announcements about bikes they're putting out, from a kind of really thinking about the concept of mobility and being a mobility provider. And so I think to that end, they're taking those bets and kind of seeing what are these adjacent areas that possibly impact their business that it can be smartly positioned and kind of lead the charge and still make a connection back into the mother core business. But it's really being smart about, I got to get a couple different ideas out there, and when they take off, it's something that we might pivot towards, especially in a very large organization with a lot of history like Ford does.
And let's not confuse things. At the end of the day, Ford is not early to this game, right? Digital disruption is already happening in their industry. And you can look back at what Microsoft struggled with in the 90s with regard to the browser, right? So Ford is trying to catch up now, and their new leadership is keenly aware of these challenges and trying to figure out how do we do this? And digital disruption is very much on their mind.
And I think that's a really good segue into the next part of this panel. And I want to, if you can put up the question on the boards here, is strategic planning conducive to digital disruption, right? So first of all, I'd like to ask the audience the question, do you think that the traditional strategic planning process is conducive to digital disruption? I heard no.
Some no's in the back. Yeah.
Why is that?
Impossible.
Hi, you can't see me down there.
Hi, I see you.
Hi, I'm the digital goddess on Twitter from Australia. And to answer your question about our companies leading with disruption, it's very echoey here. I don't think so, because traditional companies are not stacked with the existing staff to ask those type of questions. Right. They need external agencies, companies to challenge their thinking, to find the loopholes in their existing planning only to drive value.
Okay, so you're taking it from a staffing perspective and then bringing in some outside consultants into the mix? No, you're taking
No. It's not on staffing, it's on ideology. Okay. And you look at the longevity of career employees and career companies like Nestle, where they raise people in from the troops, but how much training do these people get once they're hired in at a B school? They don't get disruptive thinking. They come in with the education that they started with, and then they have to continue. So unless companies such as Nestle, large organizations, are going to encourage their employees to break the model, to hack, if you would, you won't find that innovation for disruption existing in large organizations where it is.
Okay, thank you.
So let me build on that for a second. Nestle is interesting because they own Purina, right? So Purina being a pet care food company. Interesting to see what's happened there in their business, because over the past few years, they've been trying to figure out what this whole grain-free concept is an absolute threat to their business model. It's moderately digital in nature, but at the end of the day, the core question that they as a business are being challenged with is consumers believe that grain-free product is better. Purina has always said, no, it's not. And they're watching their market share drift away quickly. It's a really interesting problem because the leadership of Purina knows that this problem is happening. They just, to your point, don't have the capacity to figure out how do you bring that into the business and launch a new corrective, a measure in some ways, to take action and fend off that disruption.
What about, to the panelists, what about the other, some of the other things that are wrong with the traditional strategic planning process?
I would suggest that, and I think many in here are thinking this as well, but as we tie everything to calendar years, or we tie strategic planning to 12 to 18 months, and we get into some of the former even processes of waterfall type of development even, it's just not conducive to be innovative, to be disruptive. At the end of 18 months, what we've produced is something that's 18 months now old, and we can't move fast enough. We're tied more towards what's the rate on the NASDAQ, or how are we performing day to day. And so how do we think about being disruptive? How do we have, and to that point, like, how do we not even think about it as a silo of innovation or disruption within the group too? I mean, if we just hire a small team that's going to be the new innovators, are we really being innovative? And that segues into one of the key learnings in what VML has done in the last few years is we've definitely defined, and similar to what Don's done, is talking about innovation in a way of not only innovation, but innovation management. I know we're going to touch on this a little bit later on, but they're two different things. And it's really, really key to think about it that way. Because if we're not giving people the tools and the resources, the management piece to be innovative, the processes will never be innovative. So approach it and think about it those two different ways.
Well, there's one more piece of that as well, which is the metrics, right? You do a job to get paid a certain amount, and you're trying to achieve your bonus, and your bonus comes if the business does well. But if we actually try and change those metrics around and introduce the idea of, have you come up with something disruptive this quarter, this year? Have you helped us actually steer the ship into a new port as opposed to the port we've been aiming at for the past 10 years? That's when the systems really start to kick in and you see organizations come to life when it comes to disrupting themselves.
So how do we do that, Don?
That can also create some negative effects though, right?
Oh, yeah.
You know, I mean, do we always have to be disrupting?
That's a really good
Can we
question.
not be in a case where we can just operate within our business strength and continue to monopolize whatever market that we're in? Why is this such I almost feel like the more you talk about it, the more detrimental it can be in some cases.
Interesting, fair point. Yeah, I mean, I think totally fair point that you can't constantly be wondering what next we should be doing. You got to kind of focus on the here and now and deliver. But I think that there's a valuable point you're making around just innovation as a department, right? That's you're doing it wrong if you got an innovation department. That should be like the #1 sign. Like, why is the guy off there on the side? They're going to dream up what's next. We're just going to keep trucking along over here, and we'll cut their budgets when we need the budget back. And that's kind of what happens in many of these cases, right? And that's actually you haven't built a culture around innovation. That's the core piece I think the comments about is how do we kind of just empower everybody to be thinking about this stuff, really have an entrepreneurial spirit inside of everyone and a curiosity, right? Well, why am I doing this? I think if we're always able to answer the question honestly, and you're going to have a solid direction that you're moving forward with on why we're doing something, and that's a core cultural thing that's got to exist.
We have a question from the balcony, and the gentleman actually came down to the center floor to ask it. So
No, in fact, it's a comment. We try to explain why a big company are not capable to do disruptive innovation in their market. That's very important to say, in their market. And there are 3 reasons. First of all, they have a tendency to milk the cow much too long. And that's natural, they are pushed by the shareholder. Second thing, they are not capable to see a different way to do what they have been doing. And that's obvious, it has been proven now. And the third thing is, I am a brand, therefore I am a media. And I am a media which means something, okay? And it's not because there is a little genius, a geek, who say you should build the energy drink of tomorrow, that me, Coca-Cola, I'm able to be Red Bull. No, Coca-Cola is not capable to be Red Bull. Okay, like Ford is not capable to be Tesla. So the consequence, what should you do in terms of strategic planning? Go into another market, because there, those 3 impairments to do disruptive innovation does not exist. So we push our customer to say, look in which market you can throw a big rock and see the disruption you will create. And that's fascinating. And my question is, since there are many people from Ford or around Ford, do the people at Ford realize that with the BlaBlaCar, with the Uber, with the driverless car, the market is disappearing? I mean, some people say in 10 years, 90% of the cars disappear off the street.
Right, absolutely. So
how they anticipate that? That's interesting.
Thank you. You want to start?
Well, I think to address the question around Ford and their, are they looking out there? I mean, absolutely. I mean, CEO just was talking about autonomous vehicle being one of the 4 big bets for Ford. So I think as they think about the role Ford plays in the concept of delivering mobility, right? How do I get to places? And thinking about that as a service that can be provided, maybe no longer being contained into the transaction of buying a car and disappearing for 6 years and then coming back, is fundamentally changing that and thinking about this flexible ownership. A lot of different themes are coming through. So I think, it's a very large aircraft carrier too, right? So it's got a direction it's on, but it's the fact that they're thinking about that and being progressive in there is a good belief that they're going to be in a good spot as we kind of go through these waters.
As an example of that, at Mobile World Congress last week, Ford was there and they weren't showing off their latest car, they were showing off the new transport specifically for Europe. It was bicycles, connected bicycles. So we're not talking about cars anymore, we're talking about transport in general, where does it fit?
Right.
Yep.
And that's really exciting too, because it goes back to the notion of, yes, you kind of have to continuously chase and follow different innovations. The market's sort of that one-to-end concept, but where kind of a company like Ford can really push the needle is, think about what's the next 0 to 1 opportunity, right? And sort of, thinking, connected bicycles, connected cars, that whole experience. That's where sort of, I think, the next sort of protective generation for that kind of a legacy brand exists and comes from.
Yeah, to put a fine point on it, to answer your question, yes, right? As Kurt said, the CEO at CES this past year made some very clear comments about this. And flexible usership is one of the things that he actually declared as one of his key strategies moving forward. Because they know that they have to move the business into a world that satisfies that consumer demand. Because people aren't buying cars in the same way that they were. And if they are buying cars, they aren't keeping them for the long period of time, et cetera, et cetera. So that challenge is very much aware to the leadership team there. What's interesting about Ford as well that's fascinating comparing to Uber and others, Ford is not a new company. They've been around for 100+ years and they've been serving the middle class in a profound way. So they have a couple big challenges. One is people don't want to buy cars, and 2, the middle class doesn't exist the way that it did 20 years ago. And they're keenly aware of those 2 key challenges, and that's why they're thinking about smart mobility. That's why they're thinking broader about what transportation could mean in the future, whether it's bikes or other kinds of things. I'm not here to defend Ford, but I think it's interesting to watch what they're doing, and I'm keenly interested to see what happens 10 years from now if they've made that migration, because it's one thing, as I said before, innovation has to actually net out with something. And for them to think that they need to do something, well, the question really is, will they be able to? Will they actually cross over that chasm from we need to do this to we have done this and this is now what we look like? And that aircraft carrier.
And I think to your point too around the happening outside the U.S. and the other regions, there's some really interesting work that Ford does and is enabling in other markets that the U.S. doesn't see, right? The U.S. has a lot of interesting challenges as it relates to the relationship between a manufacturer and the consumer and all the layers in between that, you'd really want to be disruptive, but the government's in the way. But you go into other markets, China is really fascinating right now with, as the Lincoln brand starts to launch out there, you're going to see some really compelling consumer experiences and retail experiences that are, I think, hopefully we import back into the U.S. because once it scales up there, the regulations in the U.S. that are actually inhibiting real change can maybe start to peel away.
That's a key point.
That's really too, because I think a lot of what we're talking about now is sort of fast disruption, all right? Disruption has this connotation of being something that's quick, right? But there's also sort of the flip side, which is kind of slow disruption, right, in a sense. And I think that's kind of where there's another huge advantage, because a lot of this stuff isn't going to play out over, a quarter or a year. It's going to play out over not even a decade, but multiple decades, right? And so how do you gear and plan that way versus, everything has to be nimble and fast. Of course, that's important from one perspective, but there's also this kind of slow disruption piece too that's really important to keep in the back of our minds.
Right.
I have a question from Twitter here, and I think it leads kind of into...
Somebody's really got Charlebots over there.
More beer. We need one more beer. So it leads into kind of the topic that I want to talk about here is so it says, how can companies that have been around for 50+ years prepare themselves for the rapid change what's currently happening. So all the trends and how can we prepare that. But let's talk about that, and let's talk about, like, you know, even in the strategic planning process, you know, what can companies do? I mean, these guys need techniques and tidbits to take back to their companies. What kind of techniques can we give them?
All right, so I'll throw one out there, which is challenge the premise that change is happening as rapidly as you think it is. And a lot of organizations that are out there think of themselves and say, gosh, technology is evolving so quickly, we're moving so slowly, we're missing everything. The fact is, if you actually take a step back and understand the patterns of change that are really taking place, it's not as rapid as you may think. Sure, there are new entrants coming into the market. Sure, there are new startups that are coming in with their targets aimed at you. But one of the things that we often work with our clients on is to say, let's actually understand the true change taking place and stop worrying about all the things that fly around your face that you think are changing constantly, and understand what really is taking place and get that view of what are the future dynamics that really matter. Because ultimately, anytime you're trying to embed a digital disruption or an innovation culture in an organization, the first thing you need is focus. One thing you've got from Uber and all these other startups, and the startups on the stage, is focus. They were keenly aware of what problem they're trying to solve, and they went for it. Many organizations that are out there that are 50 years old or 100 years old spend a lot of time being blinded by all the change taking place and therefore paralyzed by it. And that focus is the first thing I would counsel.
I would just say, I think it's a point that Kurt brought up too, is like a lot of it is cultural, right? You know, I think, you know, instead of saying, hey, you know, how do we sort of avoid being disrupted, et cetera, you know, I think a lot of it's focused around the people that are inside these organizations, right? It's not Ford that's doing the disrupting, it's the people inside of Ford that are doing the disrupting, right? And so, you know, getting that piece right has such a big effect on sort of how far the needle moves versus saying, oh, we have this sort of new sort of framework and profile for how we do disruption, right? It's the people that are behind it.
Culture.
Yeah. I think a piece of that is, it'll sound kind of strange, but like, what's your plan for serendipity, right? So I mean, as you build these like companies and you get lots of silos, and the real compelling ideas and interesting things that happen are those serendipitous moments where you kind of connected a couple things together that you didn't see before, and that's actually the disruption or the potential innovation. And so how are you structured to bring that to life, and are you actually thinking about that? I mean, you don't have to architect it, but if everybody's allowed to sit in departments, they're all off and running and doing their own individual things and never communicating, it's culturally, you're going to have something that's very difficult to see real change. Whereas if you've got something very open and you're creating opportunities for connections, some amazing things can happen.
Actually, we have a question over here. The gentleman in the corner had a question or comment.
Sure. My question is about quality. How important is quality for consumers and the companies that are doing disrupting? For example, $1 Shave Club versus Gillette.
Got it.
Do you understand the question?
Was it quality or quantity?
Quality. The quality of the product or service that are these companies serving. For example, let's use $1 Shave Club. You know about that?
Yeah.
Versus quality of Gillette.
Second.
Go ahead.
No. So, all right, we'll play it back to you. So it's about quality, right? And what?
Quality, right?
Yeah, quality. The quality of the offering, right?
Well, quality is a classic. I mean, when you talk about disruptive innovation, you have to go back to the whole premise of what Clay Christensen first talked about. The expectation is that quality is going to be less. The quality is going to be lower than what you can currently get in the marketplace. And that's okay, because you're willing to accommodate quality for convenience, and convenience is the thing you're ultimately after. Right. So you're willing to accommodate some drop-off in quality over a short period of time, knowing that you're gaining in other areas in the value exchange, right?
Exactly my point.
Thank you.
We have another question here, or a comment.
Thank you. My question is on decentralization. You were talking about before how everything was getting more decentral, but basically the examples that you had still have a single point of failure. Like Uber is still a company, they're just using the internet to connect people. If you look at how, let's say, Blockbuster got disrupted by Netflix, now you see Netflix getting disrupted by Popcorn Time, which is a totally decentralized movie viewing database online. You have the taxis being disrupted by Uber. When you have autonomous cars, why wouldn't they connect directly to you to offer you a service instead of going through Uber? So what are your thoughts on all of these services becoming truly decentralized with no point to regulate?
Sorry, go ahead.
I'll just come out quickly and say I think the decentralization of everything is actually the key point here. And when you think about what change is really taking place in the things like Uber and otherwise, you're actually seeing a migration towards decentralization. Even in the retail environment, the decentralization is really the core of what's happening. And I mentioned earlier, it's easy to get excited about all these examples, but when you understand what's ultimately really happening here, decentralization, I would argue, is the key point, that the key shift that we're seeing happen in the marketplace.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question, and I think probably the Fire Chat example is probably the best because that's probably closest to truly decentralized system. I think the challenge is it's still really hard to get there, right? I think that the value of sort of semi-decentralized systems is that they offer this convenience factor, right? It's reliable. You know, if I open up Fire Chat right now, I'm guessing none of you have it open, and I can't chat with anybody, right? And so I think it's a stepping stone. I think that you're starting to see it go from totally non-decentralized to somewhat decentralized, and you're right, it's still a single point of failure, but it's trending that way, right? And I guess, I think the idealist in me would say the goal should be for it to be completely decentralized, right? But we'll see. I think it'll take time.
But commodities are going to exist forever, right? So commodities are always going to lead to some type of centralization because there's an efficiency inside of that. So if you talk about the autonomous car over time, that would be centralized. Why? Because I get my greatest scale and I would drive my lowest price. I think it's the experience though, and that's something that's kind of interesting that starts to be decentralized, the ability to put something on top of that commodity that's totally different than the next thing. And to do that at scale and do that a lot of different ways is actually what we're talking about. But the underlying elements, as you said, I mean, Uber's going to be a marketplace, right? That's what it's going to be, and there's always going to be that central aspect to it, but all these other
That's a really important point too, because as soon as something becomes protocol, it's essentially open source, right? It becomes very difficult to monetize protocol, right? And so then you end up seeing this sort of cyclical behavior again, where you'll end up seeing, the things that we pay for today becoming decentralized, new value creation above that, that's non-decentralized, and then it goes again and again and again, right?
So we've solved nothing.
Yeah, we actually contradicted ourselves completely in that last
Thanks for making us feel like we've done
that. That was great.
So let's continue to talk about kind of these techniques and tools that we can help these audience members bring back to their team. So if you think about things like brainstorming or cross-functional teams or bringing in experts, or we have Tech Lounge back here. Can you talk about some of those things and how what can these guys do and gals do to bring back this type of disruptive mindset to their companies?
I've got one idea I want to throw out there to start, which is I think the first question is understanding and doing some analytics on the business model, which sounds counterintuitive to the digital disruption concept, because in some ways you think about it as being fast and loose, when in fact true digital disruption comes from a deep analytical understanding of where the fat is in the business model, for understanding where the money to be had is and where the weakness as a result might reside. So for me, when you think about what you can do to bring back to your organization, I want you to think about understanding the business model in such a way that you can figure out we're making more money here than we should. And there's, as a result, money that can be taken away from us by a new entrant that, whether they do it digitally or otherwise, have identified that we've got a weakness. And that strategic weakness, and examining your strategic weaknesses, that's one of the first things that most organizations should do on a regular basis.
I think also thinking about it from your customer's point of view and the consumer's point of view is really helpful. Like looking at what are those pain points along the experience that they have with my brand and product, and those become really valuable insights as to what I need to focus on to actually go and tackle and ensure that I'm not actually getting disrupted, because if I got happy consumers that are kind of purchasing, then at least I took care of the things that I can control. Now I got to think about the things I can't control. But so many companies
Kurt,
don't think about that.
I have a question with that though. So if you look at your customer life cycle and you try to solve those pain points, like are you still going to be disrupted though if you're not looking farther out? Because you can solve a particular pain point and still not.
Absolutely, but I think you've got to have a long vision, but you need to take care of the here and now as well, right? There's a lot of people who are just unaware of this pain point, and all of a sudden the disruption came from there, and it's always been right under your nose. How do you have somebody focused on that and thinking about your consumer, and then how do you almost have somebody else thinking about, well, where's the rest of the world going, and try to keep both of these on a path towards the future.
And a lot of that goes back to just a base foundation of the right planning and delivery processes as well. So at VML, we do a lot of agile development. In fact, the majority of it is agile development. So we talk about long-term, we talk about what's happening now, what's happening in the next 2 weeks. Let's put it out in front of some people, let's learn, let's bring it back in.
Rapid prototyping.
Rapid prototyping at the beginning of all that, to where rather than sitting around and talking about this for the next 6 months, let's put 2 people in a room, let's knock it out in 3 or 4 days, get a minimum viable product in front of them, and let them play with it a little bit. So at the core, you have to have some of those processes in place, especially in some of the larger organizations, to where you can kick those things out fast, learn, bring them back in, learn, bring them back in, and keep going. And with the sight that 18 months down the line, this is where we want to be, but it's probably going to change completely throughout the entire process.
Right.
I think one interesting, this may be counterintuitive as well, but one interesting poison, is sort of knowing too much as well, right? Knowing too much about yourself, and I almost think, the places where we find the most disruption is when, there are individuals who know nothing about what we do and almost say, hey, if I was setting out to compete with you today or, create something to solve this problem today,
right,
I would do it this way without any knowledge of anything that you do, right? And so I think there's an interesting sort of catch, kind of 22 there in the sense that the more you introspect, almost the less you have an ability to disrupt yourself, right? And you almost need that sort of very fresh, almost naive thinking to solve that problem in a different context.
It's interesting because we often refer to that as infrastructure awareness, right? Because infrastructure, if you think about things like bridges and tunnels, they support the business, they guide the business, they keep you going in the right direction. They also keep you from branching off into altogether new ways. And with too much infrastructure or a lack of awareness of the infrastructure, you're blind. So what we often talk about is helping organizations to understand what is the infrastructure that's enabling, but also disabling innovation within their four walls, because ultimately they don't know. They aren't aware enough about those barriers that are holding them in.
We need the MIB brainwash.
That's right. That's right. Forget everything.
Kindergartners.
So it's interesting, and so we got about 10 minutes left, and one of the last topics I really wanted to talk about is culture. And I think one of you, I think Don, you mentioned about Mark Fields is the CEO of Ford Motor Company, and he mentioned at the CES conference, Ford is not waiting for someone else to lead the way. How can we disrupt our own industry before someone does it for us? Which I think it really speaks loudly of the culture of Ford and from the top down. But when we talk about culture in a company, and I want to turn it over back to the panelist again, is how can a culture enable or not enable digital disruption from happening? And then I'm going to go into some, again, tools and techniques that we can help these guys to bring back to their teams.
I think we've touched on some of it already, Tony, too, and that in talking with innovators and innovation groups really across the nation here, one of the things that I continue to come back with, and I find it super, super important, is anytime we hear about innovation or disruption happening within our organizations, people start raising their hand and say, I want to be a part of that. Everyone wants to be a part of that. So if we design our...
Until it goes wrong.
Until it goes wrong, and they're like, that was not my idea. But to that point, if we segment, and it was mentioned earlier on, just segments, or this is our innovation team, and they're the only ones that are going to be innovative, then everyone else is going, well, what are we doing? And candidly, from a VML standpoint, if we say we just have an innovation group and all the other work that we're doing is not connected to the innovation group, our clients are going, what are we paying you for? Right. So back to the core point of innovation management and innovation process, what are the tools and techniques that we are giving everyone to think about these things, whether it be things like rapid prototyping or access to research, or all of those pieces that need to come together in order to empower the entire organization culturally. And not just think about it in this small little group that's doing some type of R&D back in the corner.
It has to be like your heartbeat. It has to be something you don't think about. It's something that just is part of what you do when you wake up, right? I think the moment you, again, overthink this stuff, then you end up sort of falling down this, really, really bad, slippery slope of, and I think that's an interesting example too. It's like, if I'm not innovating, what am I doing? Well, there are a lot of things to be doing today that are innovative, but just not under the forward-thinking definition of innovative. There's things, the here and now, right? Yeah. How do we solve for that? So I think a lot of it just has to be like, almost just like DNA-based.
Yeah.
And there are very few frameworks that can solve for that, right? It's the people.
It's the curiosity. People with curiosity.
That's right.
So I work for a large healthcare incumbent, and we've just recently set up an incubator in our business. And what we're finding is actually a lot of the points you touched on is really important about it not just being a separate group that's doing something, but what's interesting in our company is we've got people who've been there 20, 30, 40 years, and they watch what's happening, and a lot of their sense of self-worth comes from the fact that they know how that thing that we built 30 years ago works, and they're scared for their jobs, they're scared for that change and feeling that they're not valuable to that organisation anymore. And I think that's a really big challenge for large companies that want to disrupt and innovate, is a lot of their people, it's very hard to get them on board, I guess, with that change.
That's true. No, there's a deep fear that large organizations fear and worry about. I was actually going to start talking about healthcare because there's a healthcare provider that we worked with recently that you could argue that healthcare is going through a huge transformation right now, especially stateside, but globally, really, on two different fronts. In the States, it's all about the Affordable Care Act and what that's going to mean for consumers and for healthcare providers. Globally, it's around this 50-plus tsunami that's coming along that's going to radically transform what healthcare is needed by whom and when, right? And ultimately, why companies freeze is they sort of say, gosh, our portfolio isn't ready for this. We don't know what to do, so I'm going to retire, and I hope you guys figure it out, right? And the answer is, well, that's great. Thank you for retiring. Good luck to you. But at the same time, the challenge is, well, how do we play with this future? If we know that these changes are coming, let's do some scenario planning and figure out a pathway forward that we can disrupt ourselves in a way that sustains our business, enable our colleagues to actually have a career going forward, and ultimately meet the needs of tomorrow's consumer. And that long-term view is critical, especially in a field like healthcare where new entrants are coming all the time. The regulatory environment is super, super rigid, but consumers are moving in a very different way than they were before, whether it's because of the regulatory environment or just aging.
Yeah. Probably my most exciting vertical actually to be playing in at VML as well. Everywhere that is going as far as patients being able to consume their own health data and seeing that front end, as well as integration of wearable technologies and fitness data to show my doctor what I am drinking, what I'm doing, it's such a big world to come. And you know, I think about the providers that we're working with. I think about groups like Under Armour, who I think as a brand are completely disrupting the space by going out and buying a bunch of startups and acquiring all these users and saying, although we build stuff that people wear, now we're going to build an ecosystem around that and understand what people are doing for fitness, how that pumps back into the ecosystem. It's such an exciting place to be. So I don't know if I have an answer to your question. I'm just saying it's the most exciting thing that I've been working on lately.
I think it's exciting too because in some cases, organizations find themselves in reactive mode and they're back-footed and backpedaling constantly saying, I hope it doesn't happen to me. And ultimately, when it comes to digital disruption and other kinds of innovation, it's about leaning in and saying, guys, we actually can craft a future vision here that gets us beyond the day-to-day and takes us to a better place. And that anticipating and shaping the future is a very invigorating process that every organization, when they go through it, feels better coming out the other side because they can now make sense of the change that's happening to them, identify where the growth is going to come from, and rationalize the change that's happening today. And having that contextual view is critical to all of that.
Generation, time moves forward, right? Stuff is going to happen.
That's right.
Regardless. Generations will change.
That's right.
And it's a constant thing, right? So instead of trying to fight it, I think you kind of just let it run.
Yep.
So how do you do that though? Like, what happens if the head gal or head guy is in charge, and they're like, "What we're doing is fine. We're making a lot of money now. Why should we change?" Like, how do you handle that? When I think everything that you said is true, and I think everyone probably agrees that there's probably pockets of innovation within the company that people are like, "No, we need to change," but that head gal or that head guy is saying, "We're making a ton of money now. We don't need to change." Like, how do you handle something like that?
Go to the board.
Do what?
Yeah.
Go to the board.
Go to the board. Go right to the board. Do not pass go. I think one of the things that I've seen companies do is sometimes sliding those business books under the CEO's door, like Clay Christensen's book on disruption in the healthcare market, and start introducing, whether it's Harvard Business School, Harvard Business Review articles, or other kinds of books, saying, guys, this isn't just us making up these changes. You have really credible academics that are pointing to these changes. What is our strategy? And in some cases, asking the question could be the first step too. What is our future strategy? What are we doing to disrupt ourselves? Or what's our plan to ensure that we're not susceptible? Who can tell me here that we're not susceptible? Raise your hand. And having that conversation is an uncomfortable conversation because every time it starts with that comment of, well, actually we are. Now what? And that's when you start kicking into that process of, well, let's make sense of what's happening and get that future plan in place.
Thank you. So we got about 2 minutes left. We have a question over here.
Hi. I want to push back against this idea that change often comes from the head guy or the head gal, because I work for a company called Optimizely that lets people make hypotheses and test changes on their website or their mobile app. And I see in talking to our customers that sometimes the best idea comes from the intern or the random person in the company who's never really had a voice at the table. So one of the questions I have is, how do you guys see data playing a role in innovation and testing and doing hypothesis experimentation to see where you should innovate next, instead of just saying, this person's saying we should do this, let's go do that thing?
Yeah, personally, I think that's like a cornerstone of the curiosity I'm talking about. Like, you got to find that balance, right? It's art and science. If you actually try to, I think, test everything without thinking about it from a human perspective, you'll end up with some really strange-looking things, right? I mean, I don't know, you guys see those like mobile ads on the carousels on the sites, right? The pictures, you're going through those, top 25, I don't know, pictures of celebrities you don't want to admit you look at, but there's all these ads around there with like arrows, right? You know that somebody was testing into like, oh, if we just make it look like navigation, we get better click-through rates. So there's these moments where you're like, wow, somebody probably overthought testing there. But at the same time, we should be making choices and thinking about things that have some context that's rooted in actual fact, right? It can't be from the gut, it can't be from top down. And I think the story role that analytics plays in that is something that's dramatically shifted how we in the advertising sphere are thinking about it. I think it's obviously impacting a lot of other businesses as well.
Yeah, I think technology is a great enablement there. I don't know how many of you know a tool called Slack. Like, it's Slack is a communication tool. Essentially, it's trying to replace email and IM and things like that. But what's interesting about it is, when we introduce it into our organization, it gives people an equal voice.
Right.
And crazy things happen when you give people an equal voice. The power structure changes, the organizational structure changes. I think the same decentralization topics we were talking about apply to org structure as well, right? And as those things become more decentralized, my ability, even like in the Optimizely example, right, my ability to walk in and change the front page of a massively trafficked website so quickly has so much power, right? And I think tools and technology will start to fuel a lot of that as well. And again, almost in a way where you can't control that. It's going to happen, right? Yeah. And so, how do you
want to harness it? And you don't want to control it, right? Just want to find a smart way to tap into all the brains that you have in the organization to solve a problem.
All right, I think we reached our time. I wanted to thank the panelists very much for coming in and doing that. I thank the audience for participating today.